Hello, I'm Dennis Petersen, and I'd like to welcome you to this session of Unlocking the Mysteries of Creation. This is the 7th in a series of 12 sessions where we'll be looking at all sorts of exciting things that help us to understand better the origin of everything in the universe. Now, in this session, we're going to be looking at the subject of dinosaurs, and particularly how dinosaurs relate to man. Now, I picked up a little booklet in a supermarket some time back, and if you can see this, it says Dinosaurs, Prehistoric Animals, and it's a very colorful little thing, and I looked inside, and immediately, what did I see? Right inside the front cover, the very first thing, the evolution, the story of life. And you see the chart there that's so typical, similar to what we've seen before. Reading on the first page, I was rather interested in this statement. It's unbelievable that the first one-celled animals eventually developed over millions of years into beasts such as giant tyrannosaurs, saber-toothed tigers, and us human beings. Well, they got that right. It's unbelievable. But then it goes on and it says, the chart next to this page will show you how the animal kingdom grew and expanded into all sorts of amazing shapes and sizes. And then I looked at the chart. I wondered, well, there's starfish, spiders, insects, variety of dinosaurs, saber-toothed tigers, there's man up at the top. But there's no way that that chart can show me how the animal kingdom grew into all these amazing shapes and sizes. I began to realize as I read through this little booklet that evolution takes up most of the first third of it. And then they finally get talking about dinosaurs. But when you consider the subject of the dinosaurs, we can't help but recognize that that's probably one of the most popular themes that people draw attention to nowadays. In fact, you probably know some little boys that collect dinosaurs. And maybe you collect them, and that's quite all right. They've got all sorts of wonderful things that you can collect that help us to understand more about these amazing creatures. My son, probably the first big word that he ever learned was the word dinosaur. And I remember when I was about 10 years old collecting them myself. And I still collect them. And they're a lot of fun. They're fascinating. When we were privileged to go to Canada and visit the Calgary Zoo in Alberta, Canada, we stopped in and noticed that they had a tremendous new section called the Prehistoric Park. And on the way into that section, where there are life-size replicas of dinosaurs, I was particularly aware of a very special sign. Notice this. It says, the dinosaurs reigned for 140 million years. They mysteriously became extinct about 60 million years before man appeared on Earth. Now that sounds pretty typical, doesn't it? When most of us think about the dinosaurs, we tend to think that they died out millions of years before man was ever around. But we've got to remember that that millions of years has been a fabrication of evolutionary thinking that's been drilled at us over and over and over again. Repetitious, yes. Say it enough times, people do believe it, but where's the evidence for it? Now, in our studies together, we've looked at evidence to indicate that there may be a whole different story to understand the time frame. And if God did create all the animals to be under the dominion of man, then that puts everything in a different perspective, particularly dinosaurs. But why should we say that dinosaurs must have died millions of years ago just because we don't see great lumbering beasts like Triceratops, for example, running around in people's backyards today? Now, these animals were pretty amazing. You look at these creatures and realize that they were as big as a U-Haul truck. Some of them weighed up to 24,000 pounds. Just the skull bone alone of a Triceratops was about 8 feet long from that big horn collar all the way to his snout. These huge spikes on its head, some of them 4 or 5 feet long, 6 feet long maybe. You know what? That animal, when we look at it, we kind of admire it in a way. It's rather striking. Just the same, I don't know if I'd want to run into one on a moonlight hike in the bush country. But then there's TR coming over the hill, and up at the Calgary Zoo, you see this marvelous display of this threatening-looking dinosaur that we call Tyrannosaurus rex. Now, we're told that he was a real meanie because he had a 4-foot-long jaw studded with teeth about 6 inches long apiece. Now, it's interesting that we look at all of these creatures and we see they've got all sorts of strange names, strange shapes. They're all pretty big, but some of the dinosaurs are actually quite small. Realize that dinosaurs have indeed been found. Their bones on every continent of the earth, some kind or another of dinosaur. They've been given all sorts of strange names. The scientists have given them these names, of course. And they're a little hard to pronounce at times, but if you ever have any trouble, you might consider asking a 10-year-old boy. They often know the names and how they're pronounced. But we look at these pictures in the museums, the books that come out, the various programs about dinosaurs. Some of them are so large that it makes a family of humans look very small by contrast. But you wonder, what is the story, the real story, about dinosaurs? Their bones are found in the layers of the earth. Those layers have been deposited by water. Those bones are taken to museum laboratories around the world, cleaned up, carefully prepared, and put in exhibits like this one. But when you consider the dinosaurs, I'd like us to think of a very interesting possibility. Can you just imagine, could dinosaurs have been seen alive by human beings? Now, you better be careful. When you ask that kind of a question to some people, they might accuse you of watching the Flintstones too much lately. I asked one man, and he just figured that dinosaurs had lived with man all the time. He didn't seem to have any problem with that. And I inquired a little further, and he said he read it in the newspapers. And of course, he was referring to cartoons like Alley-Oop that he had read since he was a child. And even though that concept is understandably a fairy tale, most people, we realize today, have this idea ingrained into their thinking that dinosaurs are separated from humans by millions of years. But consider this. A man lived 4,000 years ago, just a few hundred years following the flood. His name was Job. Job had a very unique experience in that God spoke to him out loud and described some things to help Job understand the nature of God. Now, how did God describe his nature? He brought Job's attention to some of his creation. Now, that's exactly what you'd expect. What did we read from Romans chapter 1, verse 20? The things that are made declare God's nature. But in Job chapter 40, we read about one particular creation of God. There it says, "Behold now, behemoth, which I made with thee." Now, what is a behemoth? Many reference Bibles will show in the margin that a behemoth might be an elephant. Others might say that a behemoth might be a hippopotamus. Now, we don't know for sure what it was because the ancient Hebrew word behemoth has no absolute modern translation. But the description that's given in the text by God himself may give us some idea of what it is that Job was able to behold. It says, "He eats grass like an ox." Well, it could have been an elephant because an elephant certainly eats grass, eats vegetation. But it goes on and says, "His strength is in his loins," or in his hips. Apparently it must have had powerful legs. It goes on and says, his force is in his stomach muscles or in his belly. You know, it must have had a powerful midsection. But then it goes on a little further. If that was all the information we'd have to go on, we could well assume that it might be a hippo or an elephant. But there's more information. God says, He moves His tail like a cedar tree. Now we've got a problem. Have you ever noticed the tail of an elephant doesn't fit that description at all? But of course, God didn't say that He was talking about an elephant. He said He was talking about a behemoth. Now you just think for a minute. What other kinds of creatures, big creatures that we know of, could God have been describing to Job as he looked on? Well, a rhinoceros is a pretty heavy hauler, but his tail isn't much to talk about at all. You probably never thought you'd see that end of a rhino today. I hope you appreciate the trouble I had to go to get that picture. But there's more information still as we read what God had to say about this awesome creature. Now, with a tail like that, can you just imagine what an animal of that kind would have looked like and demonstrated as you watched it moving across the ground? God says, His bones are like beams of bronze. His bones are like bars of iron. He is the chief of the ways of God. Now you look at the bones that are found in museums, and they are big and powerful. And you look at these huge animals and the different parts of their bodies, and they truly are a tremendous example of the awesome power of God demonstrated in the animal kingdom. If it was a dinosaur type of creature, you could say this certainly was an animal representing the chief of the ways of God. But then the next logical question that we would have to ask is, could this animal have ever been seen alive to leave evidence behind? I mean, solid, hard evidence. Have we ever found anything that would prove that man and dinosaurs existed on this earth at the same time? There's a river in Texas called the Biloxi River. And for many, many years, most of this century in fact, it has been known that dinosaur foot tracks have been found fossilized in the riverbed. Here you're seeing a picture of part of the riverbed that has been blocked off by sandbags. Frequently, men have gone in there and examined these foot tracks, and there are many of them that clearly show us that dinosaurs walked across these flat strata of limestone rock. Now, of course, the rock would have been mud at one time in the past, and the footprints were made, and then somehow it hardened. We don't even know exactly how that whole process works. But one thing is clear, it had to happen rapidly and in conditions that were very different from what we see happening today. But for many years, not only have dinosaur tracks been recognized there at the Biloxi River, but even other things as well. As this sign on nearby property attests, not only dinosaur tracks are found, but human tracks, even giant man tracks, are found fossilized in the same limestone rock as where the dinosaur tracks are found. Some of them are so close, they're right next to each other. Now, they've been found for years, and the skeptics have insisted, well, this just could not be. These human-looking tracks, the skeptics said, must be the creative work of ancient Indian carvers. Now, it's funny they never said that about the dinosaur tracks. Why would they say that about the human tracks? Well, because you can't have human tracks beside dinosaur tracks in the same rock strata. Why not? Well, because this chart insists that dinosaurs died out millions of years before mankind ever lived on the earth. And remember, the chart was totally devised based on the theories of evolution over 150 years ago, but not on solid evidence that we know to be true scientifically. An article in National Geographic in 1954 was featured called "We Captured a Live Brontosaur." Now, they didn't really, but they were talking about these same Texas-sized foot tracks that some people find big enough to take a bath in. They sandbanked a whole section of river, uncovering many foot tracks. And then they got in and took out huge slabs of rock and shipped them all the way to New York City, where they were installed in the dinosaur exhibition in the Natural History Museum. The men who were responsible for that expedition knew full well about these mysterious human-looking tracks. I've seen their notes. They even made notations indicating about these giant tracks. But not a word was said in the magazine article. Not a word was said in the Natural History Museum. Why not? You'd think that even if they didn't want to admit that they were human, they would have at least brought out the information for the mystery and for all of the intrigue that it would cause. Human-looking tracks found with dinosaur tracks. Imagine. There have been many tracks like those found at the Paluxy River over the years, and many more continue to be found. As they are, we see continually evidence that makes them look very human. Now, a few years ago, there was some reports that were circulating indicating that these certainly cannot be human at all, and even some of the creation scientists have backed off the issue entirely. Well, at that time, I had spent only one trip to the Paluxy River. It was about 15 years ago. In fact, that first trip, when I spoke to a man who was a ranger there at the state park where they preserved a section of the river so that these dinosaur tracks would be preserved, I asked the ranger, "What's this I hear about human tracks?" And he said, "We don't know anything about any human tracks." It's funny, he didn't know anything about them. Everybody in town knew about them, but not a thing was said. Not by him, anyway. Well, recently, I have been to the Paluxy River 7 times since these reports were circulating in the later 1980s that the creationists even were backing off the issue. And it's a whole different story when you are there and see for yourself what's going on. You see, for a while, people were saying they found that there's actually stains on the front of these human-looking tracks that are very decidedly dinosaur. And so whatever that human-looking imprint is, it certainly couldn't be human. I've investigated the very tracks that they were talking about regarding those stains. And it looks very much like those tracks are actually double tracks, where there are human footprints inside of dinosaur footprints. And a whole sequence of those can be seen. They're underwater most of the time. A couple of years ago, in the late summer, the first time in 40 years, the river was so dry that those tracks were exposed. And you could actually go out there and examine them and make castings of them. And that was done. And in sequence, for nearly a dozen tracks, there was clear evidence that these are very much double tracks of both human and dinosaur. But this is not the only sequence. There are many tracks. Over 120 tracks of human-looking footprints have been found there at the Paluxy River over the years. We'd like to talk more about the Paluxy River, and we'll do that in our next session in this series. But I'd like to consider some more interesting information about the existence of dinosaurs and mankind on Earth in the past. When you look at some of the models that they've made of the dinosaurs, you can't help but wonder, what about all of those legends that we've heard about sea monsters and dragons and reptilian beasts of tremendous size that have been seen by ancient peoples of the past? From China to South America to Africa, peoples from around the world hand down traditions that they actually have seen these kinds of creatures. Of course, they've doctored up the stories with all sorts of fanciful ideas, but is it possible that these various peoples from diverse parts of the world could have all made up the same theme independently? Or is it more likely that these kinds of giant reptilian beasts were in fact seen by earliest mankind following the flood. Now, I'd like to draw your attention again to that ancient record in the Bible that was written just 300 years following the flood, Job. And in the 41st chapter, Job speaks about another animal. Actually, it's God speaking to Job. Here it's recorded in the 41st chapter. It starts out, "Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook?" Now, Leviathan, what's that? Well, it's always been known as a fierce sea creature. We don't know for sure what the word means, but many translations and many Bible references will say that this is an alligator. Does that look like what this could be? And you look at the descriptions and it seems like something a whole lot more fierce than an alligator. Alligators can't even do some of the things that are described in this passage. Most notably, get down to the 19th verse. And we read in Job chapter 41, "Out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils goeth smoke as out of a seething pot or cauldron. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth." About now, some of us would probably like to say, "God, did you have to say that?" As if we're embarrassed for God. But God doesn't seem to make any apology about it. In fact, he reiterates this fact in several ways, that fire, smoke, came out of his mouth. Out of a creature? Is that possible? Consider some of the creatures, strange as they are, that exist on the earth today. Think, for example, of living lights. You know, like fireflies. Have you ever seen a firefly? Of course, most people today, especially in North America, have seen fireflies. They're not existing in some parts of the desert regions or on the West Coast, but in other parts of the country, they're commonplace. Let me ask you this. What if all the fireflies became extinct millions of years ago? No, not millions of years ago. What if they became extinct at the time of the flood? Just a few thousand years ago. What if they've never been seen by modern man? What if nobody had heard about them, nobody had ever read about them, nobody knew anything about them, and then one day you turned up some ancient diary, 4,000 years old, where a man had written about a bug that lights up? You know what they'd say? Just like what you'd say, well, that's got to be some kind of a myth. I mean, bugs don't light up, we know that. Nothing like that exists. I think we get the point. I was once in the jungles of southern Mexico and I saw a firefly. It was a very large variety, about as big as a bumblebee. And I just noticed off to my side, it came flying along and it started buzzing, and I heard it, and I turned aside and it flicked its light on. Now, fireflies have tail lights, they don't have headlights. And the tail light stayed on as it continued to fly on in front of me, and about 20 feet away, then it flicked off again. It was about as bright as one of these little twinkle lights on our Christmas tree. And I was absolutely amazed. A bug that lights up. Well, there are other animals that do some rather amazing things too. Consider the bombardier beetle. We talked about that in an earlier session. Here's a bug that literally has a blast. A bug that produces an explosion chemically as hot as boiling water. The bombardier beetle is common today. What if they had all become extinct several thousand years ago? Nobody ever saw one of those either. Again, we get the point. There are some pretty amazing creatures out there. Just because we've never seen one, does that mean that we should doubt a description of one that existed several thousand years ago? Consider an electric eel. I looked it up in the encyclopedia, and to my utter amazement found out that an electric eel can deliver a shock of up to 600 volts. Now that's quite a bit. Again, if electric eels had all become extinct, maybe several thousand years ago, and somebody tried to tell us that there's actually an animal that can deliver 600 volts of electricity, come on. There are skull bones of some of the dinosaur types that have some very strange breathing passages. We don't know what exactly they were for, but we recognize that dinosaurs, like other large creatures, have a stomach that produces methane gas. And we recognize that it would be perfectly possible for a good belch to produce fire coming out if there was something to light it. Now, just because we don't know the mechanism to cause the flames or the smoke to come out of an animal's mouth, does that mean that we must write it off and say it could never have existed? And then what do you do with a discovery made in 1977 off the coast of New Zealand? A Japanese fishing crew hauled into their nets an absolutely amazing catch. It was 4,000 pounds in weight, about 30 feet long, and they knew it was no tuna. You look at this thing and you recognize exactly what the Japanese fishermen recognized. This was a creature that we would call a plesiosaurus. In fact, the Japanese government even published a commemorative stamp to honor their people for having discovered a recently living plesiosaurus. Now, why is it that that thing has not been publicized in North America very much? Oh, you can find some obscure articles here and there, but generally it's not known. The animals we call plesiosaurus, the museums tell us, became extinct 65 million years ago. Is it possible that there could be creatures like that that exist today, still living? And then what do you do with the Loch Ness Monster? I know people have said all sorts of things about that. The Loch Ness Monster has been seen over the last 1,400 years by over 3,000 people. And the people in Scotland believe that there is a family of these large animals living in this deep lake called Lake Ness. They think that they're creatures that's something like a plesiosaurus type of creature. Now, consider if you one day went for a walk in the woods and bumped face to face into a 15 or 20 foot long dragon. I mean, that'd be pretty shocking. Did you realize that there is such a creature on this earth today? It wasn't discovered until the year 1912. On the South Pacific island of Komodo, 1,000 creatures called the Komodo dragon lizard have been found. Some of these creatures have measured 15 or 20 feet long. And when you see how fierce these creatures look, you'd understand why not too many people live on that island. Now, when you look at animals of that kind and recognize these were not discovered until the year 1912, could there have been other animals living on the earth since the time of the flood that have actually been seen by men? Animals that we call in our modern language dinosaurs? Yet why is it when you go to the museums of the world, you see displays like this that insist all of the terrible lizards have become extinct millions of years ago? Is that true? The word dinosaur means terrible lizard. But then what do you do with another discovery? Did you realize that over the last few decades, scientists in the Congo in Africa have been on a serious search? Their quest? Dinosaurs, dead or alive. Why is that? Well, for many years, the pygmy people of that region have claimed that there is a large animal living in the swamp-infested interior of the Congo. They say this animal is something like half elephant and half dragon. They call it Mokelium bembe. They insist that it's there. They say that there's a whole family of them. In fact, if you saw a movie a few years ago called Baby, you understand a little bit about the story. And even though that story was made up, it was based on factual material. Now, a number of years ago, some of the men of the tribe there managed to spear a Mokelium bembe to death. And then they all sat down and had Mokelium bembe steak dinner. But then sadly, all of the men who partook of the dinner died. We don't know what it was that caused their death, but one thing is certain. These tribal people are absolutely certain that these animals exist. And they describe them as an animal that doesn't fit the pictures of any other modern living creature that we can throw at them. They insist that this is an animal that would be like what we would call a dinosaur. Now, they think that the Western scientists are absolutely nuts for looking after this thing because they think there's some kind of a curse on it. Can you imagine what the discovery of a living brontosaurus would do to that chart? Well, unfortunately, it probably wouldn't do a whole lot. Remember the coelacanth? And there have been other creatures that we thought were extinct that are often referred to as living fossils once they're discovered, and the chart prevails. By the way, when it comes to the study of the extinction of the dinosaurs, there have been all sorts of different theories about why they died out. Dinosaurs, as big as they were, it seems that they would be very capable to survive. Why did they suddenly become extinct? Now, we need to face one fact. We don't have any evidence to prove absolutely that they are extinct. I know that seems a little radical to say, but the only way you could absolutely prove that dinosaurs are extinct is if you could see every part of the earth simultaneously. And we don't know that. New creatures that we didn't even know existed keep showing up from time to time. Nevertheless, the study of dinosaur extinction has promoted all sorts of very interesting ideas. One theory proposed that the dinosaurs died out because the rats, which were the largest mammals of that time, millions of years ago, went around and ate up all of the dinosaur eggs. Of course, we recognize that the rats could certainly have been stomped on by the dinosaurs, and there's no reason at all to believe that rats would be effectively capable of eliminating the dinosaurs. And they don't generally buy that theory anymore. Maybe the brains of the dinosaur kind were too small. Some people think that the dinosaurs were just too stupid to continue to live. But they seem to manage quite fine on the brains that they did have all the time that they did exist. So they don't buy that theory much anymore either. Maybe overweight was the problem. Some have suggested that dinosaurs got so heavy as they foraged for food, they got slipped discs in their backs, and they all died of back trouble. Well, they've come up with some pretty imaginative ideas about why the dinosaurs became extinct. In 1946, one paleontologist suggested that a worldwide heat wave of just 2 degrees above normal would have baked all of the male dinosaur sex organs. And of course, with mass sterility setting in, it wouldn't be long before every last dinosaur died without heirs. Well, what do you think? One paleontologist suggested, in all sincerity, that the dinosaurs may very well have died out because of a mass case of constipation. Well, they've come up with some pretty radical ideas, and now Time magazine comes out and says, did comets kill the dinosaurs? Comets? Well, that's quite a switch. They're suggesting that a tremendous comet or some other astronomical body came out of the sky at 50,000 miles an hour, slammed into the earth, kicked up a tremendous dust cloud, darkened the atmosphere, the temperature dropped, and all the dinosaurs died of frostbite or something like that. But when you consider what the globe-rocking implications of such a catastrophe would be, it's no wonder that Time magazine said that this new theory could shake the foundations of evolutionary biology. The implications are staggering. But in the very end of the Time magazine article, recognizing how all these various theories of the extinction of dinosaurs have come and gone, the editor inserted a comment which I thought was very much worth looking at. It says, all of the fanciful concepts fail to account for the hundreds of other species that perished at the end of the Cretaceous. The problem, one professor said, is not what killed the dinosaurs, but what killed almost all the life at the time. Did you get that? Why didn't I ever hear that when I was in school? The whole race of every creature on earth suddenly wiped out. And then, in very skillful, though misleading editorial style, Time magazine's article concludes with this statement: maybe there just wasn't enough room for them on the ark. You know, I'm sure everybody in Time magazine expected that their readers would get quite a laugh out of that. But maybe they're a little closer to the truth than they would like to admit. Because all of these various theories have failed. Is it possible that the dinosaurs became extinct largely because of the changes that occurred at the time of the flood? Now, some people say the ark was a small object, but let's recognize that the ark was not small at all. This is a model of the ark, and we need to recognize that the Bible gives us some indications of how big it was. 45 feet high, 75 feet wide, and 450 feet long. At least 1.5 times the length of a football field. There was so much space on the ark that you could fit 50,000 animals the size of a sheep. That would more than take care of all the various kinds of creatures that would necessarily have to be on board the ark in order to survive the flood. Of course, all the animals that lived in the sea wouldn't go on the ark. Only the ones that lived on the dry land, and specifically the ones in which were the breath of life. On the ark, there was about 1.5 million cubic feet of space. There was plenty of room. Some people ask, well, was there room for the dinosaurs? Well, let's think about that for a moment. Dinosaurs, some of them lived in the water. Many of them lived on the dry land. Yeah, they probably went on the ark. But does that mean that Noah would have had to take the largest of them? We know the dinosaurs start out as small guys. Why couldn't they have been on board the ark as adolescents? And just because they survived the flood on the ark, did that mean that they would be guaranteed survival from then on? We recognize that many animals have become extinct, and especially when we recognize the terrific change in the environment following the flood. It's possible that there was a reduction in the barometric pressure. That is, the pressure of the atmosphere is less now than it was before the flood. That would have contributed greatly to the demise of very many large beasts, particularly the dinosaurs. When we think of all the other things concerning the way our atmosphere is, the way our soil, our climate, our whole environment is now compared to what it was like before the flood, we recognize why so many creatures would have had a greater struggle for survival. When you look at these ideas, these facts, these observations, doesn't it become clear again that maybe we're not seeing the whole picture? A lot of the information that we've been taught over the years, what are the full implications? Is there information, both biblically and scientifically, that will help us to have a better perspective? And as we go out and look at the world, as Job said, speak to the earth. What does it tell us? Does the Bible give us some insight? Do the fossils, the study of things like these footprints and other fossils that we've looked at, help us to understand what has happened to this earth in the past? Well, I'm sure as we continue our study of dinosaurs, and particularly on this very controversial subject of the Paluxy River, that we're going to find some amazing information. Information that most of us have not been exposed to because we've we've leaned heavily on the secular sources of information. But take the time to prove all things. Speak to the earth and let it teach you. The things that are made declare the absolute power and nature of God Himself.
Thank you for joining us for this session of Unlocking the Mysteries of Creation. This is the 7th in a series of 12 video sessions which parallel the information found in the fully illustrated book by our instructor, Dennis Petersen. In the next lessons, we're going to explore some amazing and little-known evidences about fossils, dinosaurs, and discoveries that totally change the way we've been conditioned to think about the prehistoric world. All of these excellent resources, as well as many other helpful tools, are available from the Creation Resource Foundation. CRF is an educational ministry dedicated to help rebuild the foundations of a truly biblical and sensible worldview. Contact us by writing the Creation Resource Foundation, 2100 Eloise Avenue, South Lake Tahoe, California, 96150.